Hi guys, today I want to discuss a book that I read recently. I can't call this a book review because I feel that it is not, like a review is not really relevant, I suppose, in this way, because it is in the end someone's interpretation or someone's proposal of a particular Wheel of the Year. So it would really be, I guess, more about how I resonated with it and what that wheel might look like. So a bit more of a discussion rather than a review. So the book I'm talking about is the Pagan Portals Australian Druidry book, and that's by Julie Brett. Now, this book I purchased a little while ago, and my intention was to read it at the end of the year, so at the end of 2019, because I was going to celebrate the traditional pagan Wheel of the Year, albeit flipped for the Southern Hemisphere. And the reason why I was going to do that, because I didn't want to be, I guess, influenced by what Julie might say, I suppose, in terms of a Australian Wheel of the Year. I wanted to see how I resonated with the traditional festivals or Sabbats first, before delving down this path. Now, I ended up breaking that rule, I suppose you'd call it, for myself, because, well, for two reasons. The first, because, I mean, I was already noticing myself that I was really resonating with some of the Sabbats, or at least some of the Sabbats we've had so far. We haven't really had so many that I've been taking the time to mindfully celebrate. At this point, we've just finished Samhain, and I started at the beginning of a calendar year, so it's not even using the pagan start of the Wheel of the Year, which is Samhain. So I've really only celebrated a handful of them, and while a couple of them have sort of resonated, there's definitely been some that have been a real miss for me. And I suppose, I thought, maybe that's because of what's happening with the weather and the temperature, and also, we don't have those particular markers, for example. So, we might not have, like oak trees growing everywhere or dropping their leaves or whatever it is, because we're not in that particular climate or in that particular like geographic location. So, and also, do some of the agricultural celebrations, would they have meant a lot more historically, because now we can grow everything in greenhouses, and the crops have been bred to be resistant to frost and things like that. So maybe I was thinking as well, maybe modern day doesn't lend itself to a traditional agricultural Wheel of the Year anyway. So I was having those thoughts anyway. It's not like I was thinking, oh, yep, cool, I 100% resonate with all of the Sabbats as it is. And the second reason why I decided to read this book now as opposed to the end of the year was there is a red tent, or there are a few red tents around in Sydney. The closest to me is probably an hour away, maybe a little bit less than an hour away. And so I've been watching over time to see, I know there is one sort of floating around and sort of, I think, going to pop up near me, and I'm ready to sort of like jump on that, because I would really love to be a regular circle member. But I noticed that Julie Brett was going to be speaking at the red tent that was the closest to me in early May. So I decided to read the book before actually attending the red tent, and it was an excellent prompt for me to go to a red tent and see what they're like as well. So there was sort of like two real reasons for me to go to the red tent. One, to check out what a red tent is all about, and really make that effort, even though like it was sort of like an evening event, and it's like in effect a 2-hour drive for me. And of course people are coming from longer distances than I am, so I can't really start comparing myself there. And I am such a morning lark that night events, especially on like a Sunday evening, they're really not something that I enjoy doing, especially with the drive either side of that. Anyway, beside the point. Yeah, so that's the other reason I decided to read Julie Brett's book before going to the Red Tent. So this book is supposed to be or is advertised as a companion book to the practice of Druidry. So this gives you like more of an Australian context, or like a way of thinking about Druidry within Australia and how what a practice might look like. So this book, let's have a look. Let me tell you. Not talking about the bibliographies or like the any references or anything. This book is about 100, let's say about 102 pages long. So it's not a very long book, and it is published by Moon Books. Sorry, my cat is sitting in my lap, so I have to kind of like keep moving. So it's published by Moon Books in 2017, and Moon Books is an imprint of John Hunt Publishing in the UK. So not a very old book, and I actually saw this reviewed, or at least I saw this mentioned in Katie Flowers' one of Katie Flowers' videos on sort of books that have shaped her practice. And because Katie Flowers is also an Australian YouTuber, I thought this would be something very interesting to get. So this book, let me just flip to the thing. So there's 3 parts to this book, and the first part is sort of like an introduction, like the story behind this book and a little bit of an introduction to the author. And then part 2 talks about connection with nature. So it talks about the seasons and the wheel of the year concept, and then it discusses it proposes a wheel that Julie and some of her colleagues actually practice and have developed over time based on where they are living in Australia. So then that's part 2. It discusses the different festivals, and then part 3 is more of a practice of Australian Druidry. So what it is that Druids do when they come together in a circle. And forgive me if I use a bit funny language here. I don't really know a lot about Druidry to start with, so if my terms are a little bit wonky, please excuse that. But it actually talks about, when Druids get together for a ritual or a circle, what it is they do. Like some of the commonalities in terms of the things that they do within a circle, how they like open a circle, how they draw to a close, what sort of things are they focusing on within the circle, and some of the elements that you can see across Druidry. So that's, oh, sorry kitty cat, I just knocked him in the face. And yeah, so it's broken down into 3 parts. So the first part, which is the introduction and I guess introduction to the book and the author and the reason behind this book, was the author mentioned that she had always been quite interested in like the pagan path and sort of like pagan spirituality, and she also really felt disconnected as an Australian, seeing snowflakes and singing about white Christmases while we're having like baking hot summer, and we're all eating roasts and like pudding and all of this traditional stuff that if you come from a UK traditional like immigrant background to Australia, then like you've likely, or like for example, like my grandparents both came from the UK, so you know, you've adopted that whole, you know, you do a like a Christmas pudding or like a Christmas cake, you know, you do the roast, you do all of that, those trimmings for Christmas, despite the fact it is like, I don't know, 35 degrees outside, and you know, you want to eat ice cream and, you know, go to the beach and all of that sort of thing. So Julie felt really, I suppose, like just how jarring it was to be like, you know, looking at snowflakes and Santas and stuff in the middle of summer, and then, you know, when everyone's celebrating spring and there's like Easter eggs and bunnies and every like thing, all those decorations, and we're talking about how amazing like springtime is, we're actually going into autumn, and you know, the leaves are changing color, and you know, like we're going into the dark half of the year and stuff. So she sort of talked about how jarring that was, and how you know, how difficult it can be to sort of celebrate that wheel of the year when it sort of doesn't really hold a lot of, or at least the traditional wheel, when it doesn't really hold a lot of, you know, what it is you're actually seeing out, you know, like in your own landscape. So she did spend almost a year over in UK, and her intention was to see the seasons change over there and really notice, you know, the markers of each of the seasons, and understand why it is people celebrate at those particular times of the year, and you know, what it is that people are noticing. So, and she ended up meeting up with some druids over there, and obviously you know, they invited her to the circle, and she mentioned that her intention was to actually in looking at how they celebrate at the traditional times of the year, how she might recognize, you know, changes in season for Australia, and how she might go about creating a wheel that was relevant to, you know, her little patch of the earth. So that was her intention in going over there. So then she came back to Australia, and you know, with her fellow circle practitioners and, you know, friends, she over time conceptualized along with them a wheel of the year that is more Australian based, but also very Sydney based. So obviously keeping in mind that the climate does change very much from the very north to the very south, so it was a very Sydney kind of specific wheel of the year, and then she goes into discussing, you know, what that might look like in this book. So I'll give you a brief overview of what she thinks that a Sydney wheel might look like. And she calls it the coastal Sydney wheel of the year, because of course that might be a little bit different to what inland experiences as well. And I'll put up an image, or I'll put maybe a link to an image, because this is probably quite a small one. But she's also broken it up into 8, like the traditional wheel of the year. And she mentions that it goes clockwise as the way the sun moves across the sky in the southern hemisphere. So she mentions that it will go in a clockwise direction, anti-clockwise direction instead of clockwise. So the 8 festivals, and I'll just sort of I might start it off from like the beginning of a calendar year, which is summer for us. So there's the Fire Festival, the Storm Festival, the Peace Festival, the Moon Festival, the Hardening Festival, the Flower Festival, the Wind Change Festival, and the Bark Fall Festival. So they're all talking about things that you might notice in nature, and you know, times of year. So for example, you know, the Fire Festival, this is usually a time especially in the Australian bush, where the threat of bushfires is very real. So a lot of our Australian native plants actually, they don't germinate, and they don't like seed until they get to a really hot temperature, and that's what fires are doing. They're actually causing some of the regeneration of the bush, and obviously the dying off of the old, but also the regeneration of the bush, because of those really hot temperatures that bushfires actually, you know, trigger these plants to to germinate. So and also mentioning that, you know, with the fire festival there might be bushfires, but also, you know, it's quite hot, and you know there's that danger present, you know, people that live in zones where there's, you know, the threat that a bushfire might consume their house, for example, and also that threat of I guess the heat. So if you're not looking after yourself, if you're not hydrating yourself, you know, that sort of thing, and you will, that's where, you know, you might get people that succumb to, you know, severe dehydration and may even die because of that, especially the very young and the very old as well. So there's also that sort of like danger period almost. And then you go into like a storm festival where you might suddenly start getting like cooler, like slightly cooler weather, and you'll get like rain, you'll get a rainfall. So and that's where, you know, up until that point everything, all the plants have started looking really sad and the grass is dying off because it's just been so hot day after day. So all the grass is, you know, starting to be brown, or at least this is true to my local experience. You know, the grass is starting to look really sad, everything's looking really sad and like drooping and everything because it's just so hot and you don't want to go outside and everything. And then all of a sudden you might get, you know, like a period where there's like rain for like a week or two or something, or like on and off over the period of a month, and everything starts to really perk up and then go green again, and you have this like, you know, sigh of relief of, you know, like, you know, thank God the you know, the heat has stopped, you know, like, and think, you know, like everything's starting to look green again and stuff. So and that's where Julie mentions maybe this might have something to do with the peace festival. So, you know, all of a sudden the relentless heat has stopped, and so, you know, you have that sense of peace, like you've had that storms to regenerate, you know, nature and everything, and you're starting to feel a bit more at peace. You're not feeling so I don't know, like stretched or frenetic or, you know, like frustrated. So there's that real sense of peace and like calm before we go into like the I guess the autumn and the winter period. And then the moon period normally matches up with around Samhain time, or at least Julie mentions these things do change around a little bit. You might have festivals that actually are flipped. So instead you might have a peace festival, then the storm festival, just depending on what time of year it is. And to not be overly concerned with, you know, saying, oh, it must be like on this day or like on the 23rd of something, that, you know, like listen to nature, because, you know, nature doesn't really subscribe to our calendars, for example. It just does its thing. So the moon festival being, you know, like a time of ancestors, and, you know, like obviously it's getting like darker here, and, you know, all of those sort of things you associate with Samhain, for example. And then of course you've got like the hardening, and she's talking in terms of like, you know, like trees and the ground and everything, you know, because it's winter now, and you know, like quite cold, and, you know, so you've got that sort of like hardening over like the winter period. And then you've got the springtime, the festival, the flowering festival. You know, you're starting to see buds on trees. You know, maybe there's like you're starting to notice like the winds blowing, you know, like little seeds everywhere and things like that. And, you know, maybe people start getting hay fever and stuff as well. So that it's, you know, like, you know, that spring is on the way, and, you know, you're starting to see like little bits of greenery, because of course in Sydney it doesn't snow ever, so you don't and a lot of the Australian native plants, they're actually evergreens, so you don't actually ever see 100% bare trees. So a lot of the trees just have their leaves on them, you know, right through the year, and they just drop leaves as it goes. So you don't get that really obvious sign of, you know, everything is bare or things are covered in snow, because there's none of that. So you will see greenery throughout the entire year. So it's not obvious in that way that you're going into, you know, a certain time of the year. And then you've got the wind change festival, and this is usually where I usually historically I've sort of noticed this early August, you suddenly get breezes and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, hang on, I think winter's over, like I think the season is changing, and you sort of feel those breezes, and this can be where people start getting hay fever as well, or start coming on, because the breezes are picking up like the seeds and the pollen and stuff and starting to really signify that like spring is on the way. And then after that you've got bark fall, and this is very much talking about eucalyptus trees and how they shed their bark, and especially you might recognize the symbol of the really pale white tree trunk of the eucalyptus tree, because it's shed all of its bark, I suppose in preparation for like the spring and summer and stuff. And I don't think that's necessarily restricted to eucalyptus trees, but that's one of those very recognizable symbols here in Australia. So those are the 8 Sabbats or festivals that Julie talks about in her Wheel of the Year, and a lot of it is quite recognizable to me, obviously, because I'm in the same area, and it's got me really thinking about, you know, looking out in nature and seeing what's going on, and thinking about the seasons, and also keeping a bit of a nature diary in terms of things that I've noticed, you know, like what's going on. Am I seeing a lot of wattles suddenly flowering, you know, like, and that's usually July, August. Am I seeing jacaranda trees, those beautiful purple trees, and they usually flower around September every year. And one thing that I do always like notice very easily is you can see jacaranda trees at the same time you're seeing flame trees. So if you look out into a suburb which has those type of trees, you will really notice them in about September, when you can see dots of purple and dots of red. So you see purple trees and red trees in amongst all the greenery, and it looks really beautiful. So interesting to be looking out for those native markers, or at least, you know, within your suburb, you know, whether they happen to be native species or not. You know, I suppose it doesn't really matter, but just really noticing those certain things that really signify a certain time of year for you. And finally, she talks about, and I won't go into this in too much detail, just some of the things that they talk about when they are doing, say, like a circle. And I'll read the table of contents so you understand what I sort of mean. I don't really know a lot about Druidry. My cat just will not sit still. Part 3, practicing Australian Druidry. Connecting with the spirits of place. The round of Amagen, calling for peace, the 3 ancestors, honouring Indigenous wisdom, land, sea and sky, seasonal celebrations, Arwen, Eisteddfod, feast, closing the journey forward. So those are the topics discussed in part 3. Which is more to do with, I suppose, Druidry and connecting with the spirit of place. So overall, I really resonated with this book, just because, of course, it talks about my neck of the woods, and just got me really thinking about how that I can connect to like the place that I'm in, and, you know, still celebrating it, and still having those elements that were very much, I suppose, part of my ancestry, coming from the UK, but also noticing what's going on. And she also has a little bit of a discussion about like Australian animals and plants and what they might symbolize, because you never hear about that. Of course you hear all about, you know, what the rowan tree might symbolize, and the yew, and, you know, the holly and everything, but none of those are really you know, native to us here. So especially, and the animals as well, like bears, and we do have foxes, but, you know, things like that. So instead, maybe we see kangaroos, goannas, you know, things like that. So dingoes, I don't know. So it's really nice to hear from an Australian like point of view. So I won't sort of give it a review. Did I like it? Did I not love it? What are the strengths and weaknesses? I feel like, you know, this is exactly what Julie described in terms of, you know, what it is. It is like a supplement to the practice of Druidry, and looking at things within an Australian context. That is exactly what this is. And yeah, like I did resonate with it because of course it's talking about my neck of the woods, and it is talking about symbols that I recognize and symbols that I have seen out in nature. I'm not sitting there, you know, reading all about, you know, like holly and snow and you know, all of these symbols which are not native to where I am. And you know, maybe that will always be a bit of a theme that, you know, yes, my ancestry is from the UK, but in terms of symbols and signs, I can't really be looking to the UK for that. I really need to be looking at the place where I am right now and noticing these things. So especially, you can see a kangaroo on the front cover, like, you know, maybe that becomes a symbol instead of, you know, the symbol of like, you know, bears or, you know, other things which are not necessarily native to Australia. Like, I'm more likely to see a kangaroo than a bear. We might see foxes. You know, I see a lot of lizards, a lot of goannas and things like that. You know, snakes, stuff like that. So it's really nice. And Julie does have a little section on this, which is talking about the symbols of like tree and plant symbolism. So she's talking about and also animal symbolism. So for example, you know, the koala, kangaroo, the wombat, the kookaburra, the platypus, the lyrebird, the dingo, the emu, the possum, all things that I'm much more likely to see. Of course we have foxes here, the magpie and stuff like that. And the same thing for trees and plants, like a discussion about like gum trees and bottle brush and banksia, and different types of eucalyptus trees, grevillea, paperbark, wattle, the Moreton Bay fig, mangroves. Like, it's just really nice to hear, like, and hear symbols that, yes, I recognize them, I've seen them, I know, like, you know, even just from a casual observing, like certain times of the year you see certain things, like you'll see wattle or you'll see jacaranda or you'll see, you know, for example, near my work, kangaroos start to become a lot, well, they're obviously active early in the morning, but they tend to go to different locations depending on like how hot it is. So you'll suddenly notice they're almost their return because, you know, like they've gone somewhere else where it's much more shady and much more more covered, whereas in winter they're all about like soaking up some sunlight and like, you know, lying all over the ground and stuff. So you almost see that sort of like, you'll go from seeing not many to you'll see heaps of them near where I work. So you know, things like that just notice the like the changing of the seasons. So overall, this is really interesting, and I think, you know, I mean, if you're an Australian, it's definitely an interesting read, but if you are living somewhere that is not where the traditional Wheel of the Year originated, then, you know, it might get you thinking about what it might look like for your own little patch of earth, like, you know, what things you can be looking out for. So it's a very interesting read, I think, if you're looking to conceptualize like a Wheel of the Year that fits where you live in the world, or if you're interested in thinking about, you know, other places and other ways that they might look at the Wheel of the Year, because, you know, maybe you are in, like, you know, the heartland of where this wheel, the traditional wheel originated, but you're interested in knowing about like other places and other ways that people are looking to the turning of the seasons and that sort of thing. So yeah, overall I really resonated with this book, and I'm really glad that I purchased it, and that I went to that red tent and listened to Julie speak about it as well. It was really interesting and something I'd like to continue to look into further. So thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you in another video.